The sun spilled its golden hues across the tarmac as Flight 348 prepared for its transatlantic journey. Inside the cabin, a blend of anticipation and exhaustion buzzed among the passengers. In business class, Amara Daniels, a strikingly elegant black woman in her early 40s, adjusted the cuffs of her tailored white blazer. Her calm confidence seemed to radiate, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. Amara was used to being noticed, though not always for the right reasons. Her sharp features and regal composure often led people to mistake her for a model or a politician. Today, however, she was simply a passenger, or so everyone thought. "Can I offer you a drink before we take off?" asked a young, polite flight attendant. Amara smiled, her voice as warm as it was measured. "A glass of sparkling water would be lovely. Thank you." Nearby, Marcus Whitfield, the senior flight attendant for this section, watched the interaction. His smile was thin, his blue eyes sharp as they swept over Amara. Something about her effortless grace irked him. He turned away, muttering under his breath as the plane ascended. Marcus moved through the cabin, distributing meals. He was efficient, professional on the surface, but his demeanor changed subtly depending on who he served. A white businessman received a friendly joke. A young Asian student got a clipped nod. When he reached Amara, his tone became colder, his words curt. "Chicken or vegetarian?" he asked. Not meeting her eyes, Amara looked up, sensing the edge in his voice. "Chicken, please." He placed the tray down with a thud, making the utensils clatter. The couple across the aisle exchanged uneasy glances. Amara thanked him anyway, her calm demeanor unshaken. It wasn't her first encounter with microaggressions, and it likely wouldn't be her last. Marcus's frustration simmered throughout the flight. He couldn't quite pinpoint what irritated him so much about Amara. Was it her quiet confidence? The way she seemed unfazed by his barely concealed disdain? Or was it the way other passengers seemed drawn to her presence, seeking her opinion on the wine selection or the in-flight entertainment? By the time dessert was being served, Marcus's irritation had reached a boiling point. When he passed by Amara's seat again, he deliberately avoided offering her coffee, though he served everyone else in the row. Amara noticed but chose not to react. Her silence was not a sign of weakness, it was a calculated choice as the flight entered its 8th hour. The cabin lights dimmed. Marcus appeared again, this time holding a large pitcher of milk for passengers who requested it with their coffee. He walked past Amara's seat, then suddenly stopped. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I have a splash of milk for my tea?" Something inside Marcus snapped. He turned abruptly, the pitcher wobbling in his grip. "Of course," he said with a fake smile, tipping it over her cup. But instead of stopping, he continued pouring. The cold liquid splashed over the rim, spilling onto Amara's lap and drenching her blouse. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A child in the next row let out a surprised cry. Marcus, his jaw tight, held the pitcher aloft as if daring anyone to intervene. Amara froze, her mind processing the cold, wet sensation spreading across her body. She looked up, locking eyes with Marcus. His expression was smug, almost triumphant, but there was a flicker of fear in his gaze. "Was that intentional?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "Oh, my hand slipped," Marcus replied, his tone dripping with insincerity. The woman across the aisle stood up. "I saw that. You did it on purpose," she exclaimed. Other passengers began murmuring in outrage. Someone pulled out a phone to record the scene. Amara stood slowly, her drenched clothes clinging to her. Despite the humiliation, her posture remained regal. She reached for a napkin, dabbing at the milk dripping from her collar. The cabin had fallen silent, every eye fixed on her. "I need to speak to the captain," Amara said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "You're not going anywhere," Marcus snapped. "You can file a complaint when we land." Amara arched an eyebrow. "I wasn't asking for permission." The murmurs grew louder as a young male flight attendant rushed forward, clearly distressed. "Ms. Daniels, I'm so sorry. Please, let me." Marcus shot him a warning glare, but the young man ignored it, hastily offering Amara towels. The whispered apology he murmured confirmed what the passengers suspected. There was more to Amara than met the eye. Amara accepted the towels graciously but didn't leave her seat. "I'll deal with this after we land," she said, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, their shock and outrage growing with every retelling of what had happened. Amara sat in silence, her composure unbroken, though her mind was racing. She thought of the thousands of employees under her leadership, the countless policies she had implemented to ensure fairness and dignity in the workplace. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. In the galley, Marcus paced nervously. His earlier smugness had faded, replaced by a gnawing dread. He didn't know who Amara was, but the way passengers rallied around her, the quiet authority she exuded, something told him he had made a grave mistake. Tarmac shimmered in the midday heat as Flight 348 prepared for its transatlantic journey. Inside the terminal, passengers hustled toward the gate, clutching boarding passes and carry-ons, some visibly anxious, others weary from long layovers. For Amara Daniels, the CEO of Skyworld Airways, this flight was supposed to be a rare moment of anonymity. It was a chance to observe her company's operations firsthand without the weight of her title. Dressed in a crisp white blazer and matching slacks, Amara carried herself with quiet authority. She had chosen her seat in business class deliberately, avoiding the first-class cabin to better understand her passengers' experiences. As she settled into seat 7B, she glanced around, taking mental notes on everything from the cabin's cleanliness to the flight attendant's demeanor. Marcus Whitfield, the lead flight attendant for business class, strode confidently down the aisle, clipboard in hand. At 37, Marcus was a veteran in the industry, known for his efficiency and his ability to handle difficult passengers. But behind the professional facade was a man burdened by unresolved bitterness, a bitterness that had a way of surfacing when he least expected it. When his eyes landed on Amara, a flicker of irritation passed over his face. Something about her poised demeanor unsettled him, though he couldn't articulate why. She seemed too composed, too sure of herself. It reminded him of the people who had dismissed him in his own life. People who had made him feel small. He pushed the thought aside, plastering on his professional smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped. "Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" Amara looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "Sparkling water, please." "Of course," Marcus replied, turning on his heel before she could thank him as the plane taxied down the runway. Amara leaned back in her seat, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence. The young flight attendant who had served her earlier returned with a glass of sparkling water, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on her tray table. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle. He nodded, avoiding her gaze as he hurried back to the galley. From her seat, Amara could see Marcus moving through the aisle, his interactions with other passengers markedly different. To the white businessman in 7A, he was jovial, cracking jokes about turbulence. To the middle-aged couple behind her, he was attentive, recommending wines to pair with their meal choices. When he reached Amara again, his demeanor shifted. "Chicken or vegetarian?" he asked brusquely, not bothering to meet her eyes. "Chicken, please," she replied, her tone neutral. The tray landed on her table with a clatter, making the utensils jump. A woman across the aisle flinched, her eyes darting between Amara and Marcus. Amara held Marcus's gaze for a moment before turning her attention to her meal, choosing to let the moment pass. She had learned long ago to pick her battles. The flight continued uneventfully for the next few hours, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Marcus couldn't stop glancing in Amara's direction, each look filled with something unspoken, resentment, perhaps, or insecurity. He didn't understand why she bothered him so much. Maybe it was the way she seemed impervious to his subtle digs, or the way her very presence seemed to command respect. Amara, for her part, remained focused on her observations. She noted the inconsistencies in the cruise service, the slight wear on the seat fabric, and the overly perfumed air freshener in the lavatories. But she also noticed Marcus. She saw how his professionalism faltered when dealing with certain passengers, how his polite veneer cracked around her. Interesting, she thought, making a mental note to address it later as the meal service concluded. Marcus returned with a large pitcher of milk for passengers who requested it with their coffee. He moved briskly down the aisle, pouring small amounts into cups with practiced precision. When he reached Amara's row, she looked up from her book. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I have a splash of milk for my tea?" Marcus paused, his grip tightening on the pitcher. A storm brewed behind his eyes. though he forced a smile. "Of course," he said, leaning over. Instead of pouring a measured amount into her cup, he tipped the pitcher sharply. Milk cascaded over the rim, splashing onto her tray, her lap, and her pristine white blazer. The cold liquid soaked through the fabric, leaving an unmistakable stain. Gasps erupted around the cabin. A child in the row behind her whimpered, and the woman across the aisle let out an audible, "Oh my God." Amara froze. The shock of the cold milk was nothing compared to the wave of emotions that followed: humiliation, anger, disbelief. Slowly, she looked up at Marcus. His expression was smug, a thinly veiled satisfaction playing at the corners of his mouth. "Was that intentional?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a razor-sharp edge. Marcus shrugged. "My hand slipped," he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. The cabin erupted into murmurs as passengers began whispering among themselves. Someone pulled out their phone to record the scene. A man in the row ahead turned around, his face red with indignation. "That was no accident," he said loudly. "We all saw it." The young flight attendant from earlier rushed forward, his face pale. "Ms. Daniels, I'm so sorry. Let me." Marcus cut him off with a glare. "Stay out of it," he snapped. Amara stood slowly, the milk dripping from her blazer onto the carpeted floor. Despite the humiliation, her posture remained impeccable, her dignity unbroken. She reached for a napkin, dabbing at the stain with deliberate calm. "I'd like to speak to the captain," she said, her voice steady. "You're not going anywhere," Marcus replied, his tone defensive. "You can file a complaint when we land." Amara raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't asking for permission." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken authority. The murmurs grew louder, and the young flight attendant stepped forward again. "Ms. Daniels," he said quietly, "please follow me." Marcus's face turned ashen as the realization began to dawn on him. "Wait, Ms. Daniels?" he stammered, his bravado faltering. But Amara didn't respond. She followed the young attendant toward the front of the plane, her head held high. Behind her, the cabin buzzed with speculation, passengers whispering about who she might be as Amara waited near the cockpit. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had faced countless challenges in her career: misogyny, racism, boardroom betrayals, but this moment felt different. It was personal. In the galley, Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by a sinking feeling of dread. Who was she? Why did the crew seem so deferential toward her? And why did her name sound familiar? The captain emerged, his expression a mixture of concern and respect. "Ms. Daniels, I've been informed of the situation. Please rest assured, we'll handle this appropriately." Amara nodded. "Thank you, Captain. For now, let's ensure the other passengers are comfortable." As she returned to her seat, the cabin fell silent again. Passengers watched her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. She sat down, composed but resolute, and opened her book as if nothing had happened. The stage was set for a reckoning, a collision between justice and prejudice that no one on Flight 348 would soon forget. The wheels of Flight 348 touched down with a jarring thud, mirroring the tension in the air. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers remained unusually quiet. What had begun as a routine flight had spiraled into a microcosm of something far greater: power, prejudice, injustice. Many clutched their phones, rewatching the video clips that had already begun to circulate online, while others stole glances at Amara, who remained an enigma. Amara Daniels sat in her seat, her back straight and her expression unreadable. She felt the weight of their stares but refused to meet them. Her thoughts were already 2 steps ahead, assessing the implications of the incident, not just for herself but for her company. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, Marcus hesitated at the front of the cabin. His confidence had drained away, replaced by a gnawing unease. He watched as passengers disembarked, some throwing him glares of disapproval. When Amara rose, her presence was commanding. Without a word, she strode past him, her head held high. He caught a glimpse of her soaked blazer and the stain across her blouse, a stark reminder of what he had done. In the airport terminal, Amara was immediately greeted by a discreet but efficient team from Sky World. Dressed in sharp suits, they whisked her toward a private lounge, away from the gathering media frenzy. The air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone on the ground knew who she was now, and they all knew this incident was about to explode. Within hours, The incident was trending across every major social media platform. Videos captured by passengers showed the moment Marcus poured milk over Amara's lap, followed by her calm but firm response. Hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #SkyWorldScandal surged as people debated the broader implications of racism in the airline industry. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting it from every angle. Amara's PR team urged her to release a statement, but she refused. "Not yet," she said. "I need time to assess everything." Behind closed doors, she began reviewing reports from the flight crew, passenger testimonials, and the airline's internal diversity and training policies. Her laptop screen flickered with spreadsheets and employee records as she worked late into the night. This wasn't just about Marcus, it was about a culture she had sworn to change when she became CEO. While Amara strategized, Marcus's life began to fall apart. The airline suspended him pending an investigation, and he was escorted off the premises by security. Outside, reporters swarmed him, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. "Do you have anything to say about the incident?" one shouted. "Was it racially motivated?" asked another. Marcus kept his head down, his mind spinning. He had told himself it was just an accident, a small act of defiance against a passenger who had rubbed him the wrong way. But the mounting backlash made him question everything. His face was plastered across news outlets and social media, his actions dissected by strangers who branded him a racist and a bully. At home, his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends, family, and former colleagues. Some offered support, but most condemned him. Even his closest friends struggled to defend his actions. "Why did you do it?" one texted. "Was it worth it?" Marcus didn't respond. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his choices. He thought about his childhood, growing up in a household where casual racism was normalized. He thought about the setbacks he had faced in his career, the times he had been overlooked for promotions, and how he had always blamed others. And now, he thought about Amara, her dignity, her silence, her refusal to engage with his provocations. Amara's days were consumed by meetings and decisions. In one particularly tense conference, her executive team debated how to handle the fallout. "We need to issue a public apology," one advisor said, "and we need to fire him immediately." Amara folded her hands on the table, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about one person. Firing him won't solve the underlying problem. I want to know how someone like Marcus made it through our system. What are we missing?" The room fell silent. Amara's reputation as a fair but firm leader was well known. She didn't rush to judgment, but when she made a decision, it was final. Later that evening, she sat alone in her office, staring out at the city skyline. Memories of her own struggles surfaced, being dismissed in boardrooms, facing patronizing colleagues, and enduring the constant pressure to prove herself. She had built her career on resilience, but this incident had shaken something deeper. "It's not just about me," she whispered to herself. "It's about everyone who looks like me and faces this every day." A week later, Marcus was summoned to an internal disciplinary hearing. The room was sterile, with a long wooden table and rows of chairs. At the head of the table sat Amara, her presence commanding as ever. Flanked by members of the airline's leadership team, she radiated a quiet authority. Marcus entered hesitantly, his once crisp uniform replaced by a wrinkled shirt and slacks. He avoided Amara's gaze as he took a seat at the opposite end of the table. The hearing began with a review of the evidence, passenger testimonials, video footage, and Marcus's own disciplinary history. It was damning. Marcus tried to defend himself, claiming the incident wasn't racially motivated, but his words rang hollow. Finally, Amara spoke. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you understand the gravity of your actions?" Marcus hesitated. I made a mistake. It wasn't intentional." Amara leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "It wasn't intentional when you ignored my requests? When you served me with less respect than other passengers? When you poured that milk over me? At what point does a pattern of behavior become intentional?" The room fell silent. Marcus's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no excuses. Amara continued, her voice steady. "This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about what you represent. Your actions reflect a failure, not just in you, but in the system that allowed you to thrive despite your biases." That ends today. The hearing concluded with Marcus's termination. Amara insisted on transparency. releasing a public statement that emphasized accountability and the need for systemic change. The statement struck a careful balance, acknowledging Marcus's actions while also outlining steps the airline would take to prevent future incidents. Meanwhile, Marcus faced the reality of his actions. He struggled to find work. His name now synonymous with discrimination. Friends distanced themselves, and his family grew weary of defending him. Alone in his apartment, he watched Amara's statement on the news, her words echoing in his mind. For change to happen, we must confront uncomfortable truths, not just in others, but in ourselves. Amara didn't stop with Marcus's dismissal. She launched a company-wide initiative to address bias and inequity within the airline. Mandatory training programs were implemented, and a diversity task force was created to review hiring practices and employee conduct. Her actions sparked a broader conversation within the industry. Other airlines began examining their own policies, and Amara was invited to speak at conferences and panels. Despite the challenges, she felt a sense of purpose. For Marcus, the road ahead was uncertain. He began attending counseling sessions and workshops on bias and empathy. It wasn't an easy journey, but for the first time, he was confronting the root of his prejudice. The engines roared as Flight 348 descended toward the runway, jolting its passengers from their tense silence. The usual post-landing applause was absent, replaced by murmurs and sideways glances. In business class, Amara Daniels remained composed, her stained blazer a quiet testament to the indignity she had endured. Behind her, Marcus Whitfield paced at the front of the cabin, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of what had transpired. When the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began reaching for their belongings. Marcus hesitated near the galley, his professional mask barely holding as the murmurs of discontent grew louder. He couldn't meet Amara's gaze when she stood, her expression unreadable. The flight had ended, but the real turbulence was just beginning. The airport was abuzz with the aftermath of Flight 348. By the time Amara stepped into the terminal, the story had already started to ripple through social media. Passengers had uploaded videos of the incident, their captions laced with outrage. Flight attendant pours milk on business class passenger, completely intentional. #racism on board. #SkyWorld scandal. This is what black women deal with even in business class. Shameful. #justice for Amara. Amara was met by a discreet team of SkyWorld staff. They escorted her to a private lounge, away from the growing media frenzy. The young flight attendant from earlier, eyes red with worry, trailed behind, mumbling apologies. "I should have stepped in," he said quietly. Amara turned to him, her expression softening. "You did what you could. But this is bigger than you, or me." Meanwhile, Marcus was ushered into a holding area by SkyWorld's ground operations team. His composure was gone, replaced by a growing panic as he scrolled through his phone. Notifications flooded in, texts from colleagues, headlines from news outlets, and an endless stream of social media posts condemning his actions. By the next morning, the incident was a global headline. News channels replayed the video, dissecting every frame. Commentators weighed in on the implications. Anchor 1. This incident highlights ongoing issues of racial discrimination in the airline industry. Anchor 2. What makes this case unique is that the victim, Amara Daniels, is not just any passenger. She's the CEO of SkyWorld. The revelation of Amara's identity shifted the narrative into overdrive. Media outlets scrambled to analyze her career, her rise as one of the few black women leading a major corporation, her advocacy for equity in the workplace, and her role as a trailblazer in a historically white male-dominated industry. The contrast between her stature and Marcus's behavior made the incident all the more egregious. On social media, hashtags like #justice for Amara and #SkyWorld scandal trended worldwide. Activists called for systemic changes in the airline industry, while others demanded Marcus's immediate termination. Passengers from Flight 348 began sharing their accounts, painting a picture of Marcus's unprofessional conduct throughout the flight. Amara's day was consumed by meetings. In the sleek SkyWorld headquarters, her executive team debated the best course of action. "We need to issue a strong public apology," said Maria Chang, the airline's chief marketing officer. "The longer we wait, the worse this gets." "And Marcus?" another executive asked. "Do we terminate immediately?" Amara listened in silence, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. When the room fell quiet, she spoke. This isn't just about Marcus. His actions are a symptom of a larger problem. Firing him might appease the public, but it won't address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. She glanced around the table, her gaze sharp. I want a full review of our hiring practices, our training programs, and our diversity initiatives, and I want to handle this personally. The room erupted into murmurs of surprise. It wasn't unusual for Amara to be hands-on, but taking direct control of such a high-profile incident was unprecedented. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own reality. His suspension letter arrived via email, stating that he was under investigation for misconduct. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages, and reporters camped outside his apartment. The isolation gave Marcus little to do but reflect. He replayed the incident in his mind, trying to rationalize his actions. At first, he clung to his excuses. She had been too demanding, too self-assured. But as the days wore on, those justifications began to crumble. He thought about the looks on the passengers' faces, the silent disgust in their eyes. One night, he sat on his couch, staring at his phone. A friend had sent him a link to an interview with Amara. Amara had remained silent publicly until now. Sitting in a studio across from a respected journalist, she exuded the same calm authority she had displayed on the plane. "Ms. Daniels," the journalist began, "why haven't you pressed charges against Mr. Whitfield?" Amara paused, her expression thoughtful. "Because this isn't just about him. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. But Marcus's actions are part of a larger problem, a culture that allows bias to fester unchecked. My goal isn't just to hold one person accountable, it's to ensure that no one else has to experience what I did." Her words struck a chord. Viewers praised her grace and restraint, while critics argued she was being too lenient. For Amara, it wasn't about leniency, it was about strategy. She wanted systemic change, not fleeting outrage. Marcus's disciplinary hearing was a tense affair. Seated across from Amara and the executive team, he felt exposed, his usual confidence replaced by a gnawing guilt. The evidence against him was overwhelming: passenger testimonials, video footage, and a record of prior complaints about his attitude. "Mr. Whitfield," Amara said, her voice steady but piercing, "this is your opportunity to explain your actions. I suggest you use it wisely." Marcus swallowed hard. I made a mistake," he began, his voice shaky. "I let my personal frustrations affect my professionalism. But I swear, I didn't mean for it to come across as..." His words trailed off. "As what?" Amara pressed. "Deliberate? Racially motivated?" Marcus looked down. "I didn't think. I was angry." "Anger is not an excuse," Amara replied. Her tone was measured, but her disappointment was palpable. "You're responsible for your actions, and the consequences are yours to bear." The verdict was clear. Marcus was terminated, and his actions were publicly condemned by the airline. In the days following the hearing, Amara launched a comprehensive diversity initiative within Skyworld. She partnered with external organizations to revamp the airline's training programs, focusing on empathy, inclusion, and unconscious bias. The incident became a catalyst for change, sparking similar initiatives across the industry. For Marcus, the road ahead was uncertain. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, forcing him to confront the biases he had long ignored. He began attending counseling sessions and reached out to organizations that worked to dismantle prejudice, hoping to make amends in whatever small ways he could. The plane jolted as it touched down, the cabin filled with a tense silence. Amara Daniels sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Despite her outward calm, her mind was racing. The stain on her white blazer had dried, but the humiliation lingered fresh. Around her, passengers exchanged nervous glances. The quiet murmurs of before had grown into open discussions about what they'd witnessed. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the usual flurry of passengers scrambling to grab their bags was muted. Everyone seemed more interested in Amara, who rose gracefully, her composed demeanor stark against the chaos around her. She turned, meeting Marcus Whitfield's gaze briefly. His face, pale and drawn, betrayed his inner turmoil. Amara didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The captain had been informed of the incident and waited at the gate to personally escort Amara off the plane. Behind her, passengers continued their whispers, some clutching their phones tightly. Videos ready to upload within minutes of Amara leaving the airport. Videos of the incident began spreading like wildfire. The first upload came from a passenger in row 9A. Captioned, "Shocking. Flight attendant intentionally humiliates black woman in business class." Other videos followed, each showing the same moments: Marcus tipping the milk, Amara's drenched clothes, her dignified response. The footage ignited a firestorm. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag justice for Amara. Hashtag Sky World Scandal. Hashtag racism in the skies. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and debates erupted on talk shows. Some questioned whether Marcus's actions were racially motivated, while others called it a blatant example of systemic racism. By the time Amara arrived at her corporate headquarters, her name was trending worldwide. Inside, her PR and legal teams were already scrambling to contain the fallout. "Ms. Daniels," began Maria Chang, Skyworld's chief marketing officer, "the situation is escalating faster than we anticipated. We need a statement, now." Amara leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Not yet. Let them talk. The more this spreads, the harder it will be for anyone to ignore." In the privacy of her office, Amara replayed the incident in her mind. The sting of Marcus's actions wasn't just personal. It was a reminder of the countless times she had faced similar moments throughout her career. Being ignored in meetings, questioned about her qualifications, or spoken to in tones that were polite but condescending. Her assistant entered, interrupting her thoughts. "Ms. Daniels, the board wants an emergency meeting." "Of course they do," Amara replied, rising. "Tell them I'll be there in 10. The boardroom buzzed with tension as executives debated the company's response. Some pushed for Marcus's immediate termination, while others worried about setting a precedent without a thorough investigation. Amara listened patiently, her gaze steady. Finally, she spoke. "This isn't just about Marcus Whitfield. His actions were inexcusable, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. If we fire him without addressing the culture that allowed this, we're treating the symptom, not the disease." The room fell silent. "What do you propose?" one board member asked. "We need a comprehensive review of our policies, our training programs, and our leadership culture," Amara said. "I want to launch an internal audit immediately, and I'll lead it myself." Meanwhile, Marcus was grappling with the consequences of his actions. Back at his small apartment, he sat in the dark, scrolling through the endless barrage of hate messages flooding his phone. "You're a disgrace. People like you are the problem. Hope you never work again." He threw his phone onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The suspension notice from Skyworld sat unopened in his email inbox. But he didn't need to read it to know his career was over. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a bad day at work. It was the culmination of years of bitterness and resentment he had allowed to fester. Flashes of his past surfaced, growing up in a household where prejudice was casually ingrained, struggling to gain respect in a competitive industry, feeling overshadowed by colleagues who seemed to climb faster than he did. None of it excused his actions, but it explained how he had arrived here. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered to himself. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. 2 days later, Amara made her first public appearance since the incident. Standing at a podium in Skyworld's press room, she faced a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed as she began speaking. "Let me begin by saying that what happened on Flight 348 was unacceptable. It was a failure, not just of one individual, but of the systems that allowed this to happen. As CEO, I take full responsibility for ensuring that our employees are held to the highest standards of professionalism and respect." Her tone shifted, becoming more personal. "As a black woman, I know what it's like to face bias and discrimination. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have experienced similar moments and didn't have the platform to speak out." The room was silent, every reporter hanging on her words. "We are launching a full investigation into the incident and implementing immediate changes to prevent this from happening again. This isn't just about accountability, it's about progress." Her statement struck a delicate balance, acknowledging the gravity of the situation while positioning Skyworld as a company committed to change. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with many praising her grace under pressure behind closed doors. Marcus faced his disciplinary hearing. The sterile room felt suffocating as he sat across from Amara and the Skyworld leadership team. He avoided her gaze, his hands trembling. The evidence was presented: video footage, passenger testimonials, and Marcus's prior disciplinary record. It painted a damning picture. When given the chance to speak, Marcus struggled to find the words. I didn't mean for it to get this bad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was frustrated. I wasn't thinking." Amara leaned forward, her expression calm but unyielding. "Frustration doesn't excuse your actions. Mr. Whitfield, your behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. Do you understand the impact of what you did? Not just on me, but on every person who watched that video and saw themselves in my place." Marcus nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." The room was silent for a long moment before Amara spoke again. "The first step is acknowledging what you've done. But apologies mean nothing without action." The hearing concluded with Marcus's termination. But Amara made it clear that this wasn't the end. Sky World announced a comprehensive overhaul of its diversity training and employee evaluation processes, setting a new standard for accountability in the industry as the days passed. Amara's actions began to shift the focus of the conversation. Articles highlighted her leadership, praising her for turning a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for change. Industry leaders reached out, inviting her to speak at conferences and share Skyworld's new initiatives. Meanwhile, Marcus began a journey of his own. Stripped of his career and reputation, he attended counseling sessions and began volunteering with organizations focused on combating bias and discrimination. For the first time, he confronted the prejudices he had carried for so long. The fallout from the Flight 348 incident was far-reaching, reverberating through the aviation industry and beyond. Amara Daniels had become an unwitting symbol of dignity and resilience, her measured response earning her widespread admiration. But with the praise came scrutiny. Critics questioned whether her handling of Marcus Whitfield had been too lenient, while others demanded that her efforts to reform Sky World extend to confronting the broader issue of systemic racism in corporate culture. At Sky World headquarters, Amara worked tirelessly. Meetings with legal teams, press briefings, and internal reviews consumed her days. But her mind often returned to a single, nagging thought. Was her response enough? Would this incident spark lasting change? Or would it become another story lost in the endless cycle of public outrage? For Marcus, the days following his termination were a blur of shame and isolation. The vitriol online was relentless. Even mundane tasks like grocery shopping became fraught with tension as people recognized his face and whispered behind his back. Friends stopped calling. Family gatherings turned cold. He avoided the news, knowing it would only deepen his despair. Alone in his cramped apartment, Marcus replayed the incident in his mind. The humiliation he felt was nothing compared to the pain he had caused. For the first time, he began to confront the prejudices that had shaped his actions. One evening, while scrolling aimlessly through his phone, he stumbled upon an interview with Amara. Her words struck him deeply. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about accountability and growth. If we want change, we have to give people the tools to be better. Marcus sat in the dark, her voice echoing in his mind. He realized he had a choice: remain bitter and resentful, or try to become the person she believed people could be. Determined to use the incident as a springboard for change, Amara launched Project Ascent, a groundbreaking initiative aimed at tackling unconscious bias and fostering diversity within the airline industry. The program included mandatory training sessions, mentorship programs for underrepresented employees, and partnerships with advocacy groups. The project's rollout was met with mixed reactions. While many praised its ambition, skeptics doubted its effectiveness. Amara, however, remained steadfast. She personally attended the first training session, standing alongside entry-level employees as they engaged in honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about privilege and prejudice. At the end of the session, one employee approached her. "I've worked here for 20 years, he said, his voice trembling, "and this is the first time I've felt seen. Thank you." Amara smiled, feeling a rare moment of validation. Change was slow, but it was happening. Marcus's path toward redemption began with a reluctant phone call to a local diversity center. Nervously, he asked if there were any volunteer opportunities available. The center's director, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, agreed to meet him. "So, you're the guy from that plane?" Carla said bluntly when they met. Marcus flinched but nodded. You want to help? She continued. Fine, but this isn't about making you feel better. It's about the work. Are you ready for that? I think so, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Carla assigned him to assist with logistics for their upcoming community outreach program. At first, Marcus struggled with the discomfort of being surrounded by people who had every reason to resent him. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to listen to the stories of those who had faced discrimination, to the anger and pain that mirrored what Amara must have felt on that flight. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Marcus stayed behind to talk to Carla. How do you move forward after realizing you've been part of the problem? He asked. You don't, Carla replied. Not completely, but you show up, you do the work, and you let your actions speak louder than your mistakes. Months after the incident, Marcus reached out to Amara through her office. To his surprise, she agreed to meet. The two sat across from each other in a small conference room at Sky World headquarters. The tension palpable. Thank you for seeing me, Marcus began, his voice shaky. I don't even know where to start. Start with the truth, Amara said, her tone calm but firm. Marcus took a deep breath. I was wrong. What I did to you was cruel and inexcusable. I've spent these months trying to understand why I acted the way I did. And I've realized, I've been carrying this bitterness, this prejudice, for years, and instead of facing it, I let it define me. Amara listened, her expression unreadable. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Marcus continued. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm volunteering at a diversity center. And I've been attending workshops. It's not enough, I know that. But it's a start. Amara studied him for a moment. You're right, it's not enough. But it's something. Growth isn't linear. And it's not easy. What matters is that you keep going. For the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. He realized that while he might never erase his mistakes, he could choose a different path moving forward. The one-year anniversary of the Flight 348 incident marked a turning point for both Amara and Marcus. At Sky World, Project Ascent had begun yielding tangible results. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvements, and the airline's new mentorship program had already helped dozens of employees advance in their careers. Amara was invited to speak at a global aviation conference, where she shared her vision for a more inclusive industry. Her speech ended with a standing ovation, cementing her legacy as not just a corporate leader, but a social innovator. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his work at the Diversity Center. He had become a quiet but dedicated advocate for change, sharing his story with others who were grappling with their own biases. Though the road ahead remained long, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before in the final chapter. Amara boards another Sky World flight, this time en route to a speaking engagement. As she settles into her seat, she notices a nervous flight attendant nearby. The young man stumbles over his words as he offers her a drink. Amara smiles warmly. Take a deep breath, she says. You're doing fine. The flight attendant nods, his shoulders relaxing. Amara looks out the window as the plane ascends, the clouds stretching endlessly ahead. She thinks about the journey, hers, Marcus's, and everyone else's. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible, and sometimes, that was enough. The story closes with a sense of hope. A reminder that even in moments of conflict and pain, there is room for growth, redemption, and progress. The Flight 348 incident sparked global conversations. But for Amara Daniels, it was deeply personal. As her company rolled out initiatives and public discourse buzzed about her grace and resilience, she struggled with a quieter storm within. Each day brought new challenges, a barrage of media requests, internal resistance to changes, and the nagging question, was this enough? The world watched her every move. Her decision to lead systemic change rather than merely punish Marcus Whitfield was both celebrated and criticized. Some praised her vision, calling her a leader of extraordinary foresight. Others accused her of being too lenient, questioning why she hadn't pressed for criminal charges. Amara often stayed late in her office, poring over emails from strangers, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, others offering support, and still others lashing out with skepticism or disdain. One evening, a message caught her eye. It was from a woman in Ghana who had been inspired to stand up to a hostile manager after watching Amara's interview. I realized I didn't have to stay silent. The email read, You showed me that dignity doesn't mean passivity. Amara's chest tightened. In that moment, she knew that her fight wasn't just about Skyworld or Marcus. It was about everyone who had ever been told to endure injustice and silence. For Marcus, the world outside his apartment felt hostile and unrecognizable. Trips to the grocery store became exercises in paranoia, as strangers cast sidelong glances or whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. Job interviews were non-existent. His name was now synonymous with public shame. Even his own family had grown distant, unsure of how to address the elephant in the room. One evening, while scrolling through news articles about the incident, Marcus came across a feature on Amara's Project Ascent. He read about her initiatives, the mandatory diversity training, the mentoring programs, the external audits, and felt a pang of shame. While he wallowed in self-pity, she had turned her humiliation into a movement for progress. Fueled by a mix of guilt and desperation, Marcus searched for ways to contribute. He contacted local organizations, offering to volunteer. Most ignored him, some outright refused. Finally, the Community Diversity Network, CDN, agreed to let him assist with logistics for an upcoming event. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start at CDN. Marcus found himself surrounded by people with stories far more harrowing than his own. There was Tara, an immigrant who faced daily microaggressions at her office job, and Raj, a teacher who had been passed over for promotions despite his stellar record. Listening to their experiences, Marcus felt his defenses begin to crumble. During one session, the group facilitator asked, "What does accountability mean to you?" Marcus hesitated, then spoke, "I think it means owning up to your actions, even when it's uncomfortable, and trying to make things right, not because you want forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." The room was silent for a moment before Tara nodded. "That's a start." Those words stayed with Marcus. Over time, he became more involved in the center, eventually leading workshops for others struggling to confront their biases. His transformation wasn't linear, there were setbacks, moments of defensiveness and shame, but he persisted. At Skyworld, Amara faced resistance from unexpected corners. Some senior executives viewed her initiatives as overreactions, arguing that the company's diversity metrics were already above industry standards. One even suggested quietly shelving Project Ascent to avoid further scrutiny. Amara stood her ground. "If we're not willing to confront uncomfortable truths, then we're complicit in perpetuating them. This isn't about metrics, it's about people." But her convictions came at a cost. Anonymous emails accused her of exploiting the incident for personal gain. Rumors swirled about board members questioning her leadership. Even within her own ranks, there were whispers of dissent. One evening, as Amara prepared for yet another late-night meeting, her assistant entered with a hesitant expression. "Ms. Daniels, there's someone here to see you. He says it's important." Amara frowned. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "It's Marcus Whitfield." Amara agreed to meet Marcus in a private conference room. As he entered, she noticed the changes in him, his slouched posture, the bags under his eyes, the humility in his expression. He was a far cry from the smug flight attendant who had poured milk over her months earlier. "Thank you for seeing me," Marcus began, his voice trembling. "I wasn't sure if you would." Amara crossed her arms. "Why are you here, Mr. Whitfield?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, "not just for what I did to you, but for everything that led up to it, the way I carried myself, the biases I ignored, the harm I caused without even realizing it. I've been working with a diversity center, and it's opened my eyes to things I should have understood a long time ago." Amara's gaze remained steady. "And what do you want from me?" "Nothing," Marcus replied quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know that I'm trying to change." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Amara sighed. "Change isn't a destination, Mr. Whitfield. It's a process. And it's not for me to decide whether you've earned redemption. That's up to the people you've hurt." Marcus nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you for hearing me out." As he left, Amara felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, hope. Perhaps change, however imperfect, was possible after all. Months later, Project Ascent had begun yielding tangible results. Employee satisfaction surveys showed marked improvements, and several underrepresented employees had been promoted through the mentorship program. Amara's leadership earned her invitations to speak at global forums, where she shared her vision for a more inclusive corporate culture. At one such event, she closed her speech with a powerful statement. Accountability isn't about assigning blame, it's about creating space for growth. If we're willing to listen, to learn, and to lead with integrity, then change is not only possible, it's inevitable. Her words resonated far beyond the aviation industry, inspiring companies across sectors to examine their own practices. The story's final chapter brings Amara and Marcus's journeys to an unexpected intersection. At a community event hosted by the CDN, Marcus spots Amara in the audience. She's there as a guest speaker, invited to discuss Project Ascent. After her speech, Marcus approaches her tentatively. "Ms. Daniels," he says, his voice steady but nervous. "I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on change, even when people like me made it harder." Amara looks at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Change isn't about perfection, Marcus. It's about persistence." As the event winds down, Amara watches Marcus interact with other attendees, sharing his story and listening to theirs. For the first time, she feels a sense of closure, not because the past has been erased, but because it has been transformed into something meaningful. Above the clouds, where Flight 348 first collided with injustice, new paths had been forged. And below them, on solid ground, both Amara and Marcus had found the courage to keep moving forward months after the Flight 348 incident. Amara Daniels reflected on the changes her company had undertaken. Project Ascent was making progress, but progress often came with resistance. Internally, some employees questioned whether the diversity programs were truly necessary, while others worried about the long-term impact on the company's image. Externally, critics scrutinized her every decision, waiting for her to falter. One particular meeting with the Skyworld board was especially tense. A senior executive voiced concerns. "Amara, while we commend your dedication, the costs of these initiatives are escalating. We've already allocated millions to training programs and audits. Are we certain this will yield measurable returns?" Amara's response was calm but firm. "If we measure success only in dollars, we're missing the point. The return on this investment isn't just financial, it's about trust, integrity, and the well-being of our employees and customers. That's priceless." Her words hung heavy in the room. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged skeptical glances. Amara left the meeting knowing she had won another battle. But the war for lasting change was far from over. Meanwhile, Marcus Whitfield continued his journey of self-discovery and accountability. Working at the Community Diversity Network, CDN, had become a lifeline. Each day brought new challenges: listening to survivors of discrimination, organizing workshops on bias, and confronting his own flawed assumptions. One day, Carla, the CDN director, approached him. "Marcus, you've been doing good work, but real growth comes from vulnerability. Are you ready to share your story with others?" The thought terrified him. The idea of standing in front of strangers and admitting his mistakes felt like peeling away the last layer of armor he had. But he also knew Carla was right. "I'll do it," he said, his voice trembling. His first speaking engagement was at a small community center. As he stepped onto the stage, his hands shook, and sweat dampened his shirt. He began hesitantly. "My name is Marcus Whitfield, and I'm here to talk about how I failed, how I let my biases hurt someone, and what I've learned since." The audience, initially reserved, grew attentive as Marcus recounted his story. He spoke about his upbringing, his insecurities, and the incident with Amara. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he concluded. "I'm here because I want to be better, and I hope my mistakes can help others avoid making the same ones." By the end of the talk, several attendees approached him. One woman, a teacher, said, "Your honesty gives me hope. If someone like you can change, maybe others can too." For the first time in months, Marcus felt something resembling peace. Despite her successes, Amara found herself at a crossroads. The pressure from Skyworld's stakeholders was mounting, and she began receiving anonymous threats online. Some accused her of being too lenient, others branded her an opportunist. She confided in her closest friend, Lydia, over dinner one evening. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," Amara admitted. "For every step forward, it feels like there are 10 more obstacles waiting." Lydia placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Change is hard, Amara, but you've already accomplished so much. Don't lose sight of that." Amara nodded, but the doubts lingered. That night, She found herself replaying the video of the Flight 348 incident, not to relive the humiliation, but to remind herself why she had started this fight in the first place. The faces of the passengers flashed in her mind, especially the younger ones. She thought of the email from the woman in Ghana, of the employees who had thanked her for giving them a voice. This is bigger than me, she whispered to herself. It always has been. One afternoon, during a visit to a Sky World-sponsored community event, Amara encountered Marcus again. He was helping set up a booth for CDN, his movements focused and deliberate. When their eyes met, he froze, unsure whether to approach her. Amara took the initiative. "Marcus," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "Ms. Daniels," he replied, lowering his gaze. "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't know you were working with CDN," she said, her curiosity piqued. "I've been volunteering with them for a while now," he explained. "They've taught me a lot. About myself, about the world, about the harm I've caused." Amara studied him for a moment. His demeanor had changed. He seemed more grounded, less defensive. "It's good to see you putting in the work," she said finally. Marcus nodded, his voice steady but earnest. "I'll never undo what I did, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be better." Amara's expression softened. "That's all anyone can ask." Months later, Amara was invited to deliver the keynote speech at the Global Leadership Summit, a prestigious event attended by some of the world's most influential figures. Standing before a packed auditorium, she spoke about the lessons learned from the Flight 348 incident. True leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about how we respond to them. She began, "When faced with injustice, we have two choices: to act out of fear or to lead with courage. At Sky World, we chose courage." She shared details about Project Ascent and the tangible changes it had brought. But she didn't shy away from the challenges. The work is never easy. And it's never done. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to the world we want to build. Her speech ended with a standing ovation, cementing her reputation as not just a corporate leader, but a global advocate for equity and justice. The story concludes with Amara reflecting on the year since Flight 348. She had grown as a leader, faced adversity with grace, and helped create a culture of accountability within her company. Yet she knew the journey wasn't hers alone. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest employee survey results, her assistant entered with an envelope. "This came for you," he said. Amara opened it to find a handwritten note from Marcus. "Dear Ms. Daniels, thank you for holding me accountable. Your actions forced me to confront myself in ways I never imagined. I will never forget the harm I caused, but I hope to honor your grace by continuing to grow and give back. You changed my life in ways I can't fully express. And for that, I am forever grateful. Sincerely, Marcus Whitfield." Amara folded the note carefully, placing it in her desk drawer. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't meant to be. But it was a reminder that even the darkest moments could lead to transformation. As she looked out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. The work was far from over. But for the first time, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Change was slow, messy, and often painful, but it was always worth the fight.